So let me tell you a little bit about this project, very much a work in progress. It's taking me a long time to write it. It's probably one of my most ambitious books. It is a cultural history of Harlem. Harlem sits at the base of it, and from there, the city of New York. During the 1940s, actually to be specific, from about 1938 to 1949, around the time of the passage of the Urban Renewal Act, when things begin to change significantly. This is a period that people have written about, that people have thought about for some time. What I hope is different about the project that I'm engaged in is it's looking at that history through the lives and works of four women artists. And so basically, I sort of have four protagonists. The reason why I chose them, there are a number of reasons, I'll talk about it a little later, but one of the more specific reasons why I chose them is that they all live in Harlem during this period. All of them live in Harlem. I'll tell you a little bit about each of them. Ann Petrie is the one I've been working on the longest, and the one with whom I was most familiar initially because I'm a literary scholar and she's a novelist. And she moved to Harlem in 1938 with her husband from Old Saybrook, Connecticut. She wrote about Harlem, wrote a number of short stories about Harlem and a novel about Harlem, but that's not the only reason why I chose her. I chose her because she's really in the thick of Harlem political and cultural life during this period. There are a number of reasons why. She works for a newspaper called The People's Voice. Have you all come across The People's Voice yet? Okay. People's Voice was a newspaper founded by and published by Adam Clayton Powell, right? It was sort of the journalistic wing of his activism. It was considered more radical than any of the other Harlem newspapers, less sensationalist than the Amsterdam News, for instance. And I would tell you how radical it was considered, that they used to call it kind of the daily worker of Harlem, right? It's like, compare it to the communist newspaper. Many of the people who worked in the newsroom were affiliated with the party, and a number of them would, suffer under the repression of the McCarthy era. Petrie, I've not been able to place within the party itself, but she's surrounded by and she is, at that time, she's a leftist. She's surrounded by kind of the black left of Harlem. So she works for The People's Voice. She is the woman's editor. She basically covers society page, right? But she also writes a number of articles. Sometimes then she writes a number of editorials that are unsigned. The great thing about this is that she knows Harlem from Strivers Row to Sugar Hill to the place where the poorest southern migrants are moving in. She walks that beat. She had been a reporter and then she becomes an editor. You kind of follow her through the 1940s and you get a real sense of the sort of texture of the city. She is engaged in a number of civic and political activities through The People's Voice. Some of the things that she has also organized herself, including an organization called Negro Women Incorporated, which later she would say was a consumer advocacy organization, right? But really it was an organization, an attempt to organize black women around the issues that most affected them, particularly economic issues, right? She also was involved in the American Negro Theater, kind of the foundation of radical black theater, founded in the 1940s. So there she was associating with people who were politically engaged actors, Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Lloyd Richards, who would later go on to be the Broadway director of all of August Wilson's plays. He's there too. It's kind of not just a hotbed of political activity, but it's also this place that's going to nurture young artists who would become major stars by the 50s. Ruby Dee and Ossie Davis are there, right? And so Petrie is right in the middle of that. She is significant to me in this project because I want to keep Harlem kind of as the center of it. Petrie is the one who stays mostly in Harlem. I mean, as far as I can trace her, as far as she doesn't even leave. She comes to the very tip by coming to Columbia for classes, right? So Columbia for her is just another Harlem institution, right? She takes classes in creative writing. But to really get a feel for just what everyday life is like, following Petrie is a great way to do it. She writes a short story called In Darkness and Confusion. And In Darkness and Confusion is a story about all of her stories at this time are about working class people, most of whom are migrants. She is always writing stories in her most famous novel, The Street, about a Harlem that's just about to explode. And this is before Langston Hughes' famous poem, Or Does It Explode, right? So she writes this short story. It's about a family, but she allows us to have specific people who we can walk the streets of Harlem with right at the beginning of August 1943. And one of her characters is in a hotel that's very much like the Braddock, and the story ends up about being part of the crowd during the Harlem riot of 43. So that's Petrie. She's one of the people who take us through Harlem. The second person is Pearl Primas, who is Trinidadian born, dancer, choreographer, not as famous today as Katherine Dunham, though she should be. Always related her art to her political activism. In fact, I open up with her attending one of the Negro Freedom rallies at Madison Square Garden in 1943. She would be at most of the political rallies providing a source of entertainment. She was probably one of the major artists to bring African dance to the American stage. So she already has a kind of internationalist perspective. She's a Pan-Africanist early on and very much engaged in seeing no separation between her politics and her art. The third person is Mary Lou Williams, composer, pianist, brilliant self-taught musician who moves to Harlem in the early 40s. Actually, she moves in 43. And her introduction into the relationship between Harlem artists and Harlem politics is she performs at a rally for Benjamin Davis, who would become Harlem's councilman, Communist Party member, right? Councilman. And so she's one of the many performers who would perform there. And she becomes, of the four women, she's the one who maintains a home in Harlem until the day she dies. And the fourth woman takes us to a different part. So we kind of have this sort of mapping going on here. We have Petrie, who's basically situated in Harlem and gives us a real sense of what that place is like in the 1940s. We have Primas, who's moving in and out of kind of left-wing dance circles, especially the New Dance Group, which is a group that believes that dance should have some relationship to the social and political and also be about trying to make social change. So she's moving in and out of that. We have Mary Lou Williams, who is in Harlem and spends her night down in the village at Cafe Society. Right? She's the house pianist, basically, there at Cafe Society. So while she's not doing a lot in the beginning in terms of her politics in Harlem, if you know anything about Cafe Society is where Langston Hughes would come up with Paul Robeson on his arm, and Adam Clayton Powell would be sitting there. He enjoyed the intellectual conversation, but he was also falling in love with a young pianist named Hazel Scott, whom he would marry at some point. So all of this is going on. Mary Lou Williams is there, and she really becomes politicized in that context, right? So she takes us from Harlem. She shows us the connections between Harlem and the village. My final person is a truly fascinating woman. There's a new documentary out about her, if you get a chance to see it. Her name is Alice Neale. And she is the only one of the three women who is not African American. She is a white woman. She is the only one of the three women who was definitely, without question, a member of the Communist Party. When she becomes pregnant with for a Latino man in the late 30s, she has to move to Harlem because you have to remember, New York is, you know, it's up north, but it's a Jim Crow town, right? And there aren't many places where African Americans can live or even patronize. So once she becomes pregnant with this colored baby, she's got to move uptown. She moves to East Harlem, which is not yet El Barrio, but it will become El Barrio. And she, in her paintings, through her paintings, documents not grand figures, but she documents the immigrants who are coming in from Puerto Rico, right? And she documents them in such a way to show their national, you know, sense of national identity, but also their racial diversity, right? And she mostly paints women and families, but that's not all. She paints tuberculosis victims. And she is also the only one of the three women who is not acquiring a degree of fame at this time. And I'll talk a little bit about why the 40s become so important for these women to become famous. But she does not. She's kind of laying low, or I should say laid low, because the artistic community in New York won't recognize her, right? They won't recognize her. One of the reasons why, and I think this is why I love her so much, she continues to paint figures. She paints people. She cares about people. This is a period when we start to get the emergence of abstract expressionism. She never goes there. To her, it's politically bankrupt. She's not going to do that. And she says, you know, when they talk about her not painting abstraction, she says, well, turn the painting upside down. It's abstract if you do that, right? So she's a fascinating, fascinating woman. She will raise two sons as a single mother in Spanish Harlem. She's also the only one who I know for a fact was visited by the FBI when we get the rise of McCarthyism, right? Petrie leaves town when all of her friends start getting called before McCarthy. So I don't know what happens to her. Primas, there's some suggestion that she's under surveillance, right? But Neale actually does get visited by the FBI. So those are the women. Let me step back a little bit and talk about a little about method. One, I'm very much interested in Harlem as a space that is where there is always a contestation over what it will be, who it will belong to, and what it will mean, right? What will Harlem mean? And that contest is going on between mainstream media that's trying to represent it in one way and the black media that's trying to represent it in another way, right? It will go on between black people themselves in Harlem, right? It'll go on between the nationalists and the leftists, although those aren't really strictly defined lines in every case. Someone like Queen Mother Audley Moore, who will become, well, Queen Mother of the Black Nationalist Movement, is the campaign director for Benjamin Davis, right? So the lines can be fluid sometimes, right? So that's another kind of point of contestation. Harlem as a space where literally the space itself is being fought over, but also what it means, right? What it means to the world, what it means to the country. It already has a sense of itself as the kind of global capital of the black world, right? It's had that for a while. By the time, the period I'm talking about, it's had that for about 20 years. Now, an important thing is the distinction between this period and the period that is most well known, and that's, of course, the Harlem Renaissance period. This period is different for a number of reasons. As with Black America in general in the 1940s, there's this feeling that there's something new underfoot, right? There is the Double V campaign, right, where we'll be patriotic, we'll fight, but we're not going to give up our fight for civil rights here. You know, we're not going to be accused of being unpatriotic here. So there's the Double V campaign. There's a sense of movement and mobility as more and more migrants become parts of cities. It's the time of the second Great Migration, which is very different in character from the first Great Migration. The artistic movement is also very different, even though you'll still have some figures from the earlier period who join this period as well, most notably Langston Hughes, right? Langston Hughes is a star of the Harlem Renaissance, and becomes a kind of dean of African American letters during this time. So he's still there. But it's different in that the artists are very self-conscious about defining themselves over and against the image of them in the 1920s, right? They are not as accepting of white patronage. They saw white patronage as being one of the things that stifled the movement in the 20s. They are much more explicitly political. They connect their work not just, and this is important. I don't want you to think of the arts as kind of a reflection of society. They see their artwork as really shaping society, helping to influence society, right? It's a way of practicing their politics, right? So there's no distinction for them between kind of a formalism and a politically engaged art. So in that way, it's different as well. It's especially different for the women that I'm interested in because I don't think ever before do we have sort of the kind of mainstream cultural apparatus opening up in ways that it does to women at this period. The 1920s didn't do it. Petrie's books are reviewed in the Times. Pearl Primas is the darling of the New York Times dance critic. Mary Lou Williams gets reviewed widely. Again, I told you Alice Neal doesn't, which says something about them, but also says something about the time period as well. So one of the things Romary Bearden, the artist, said about this period, he was coming of age during this time. He says, the movement was a positive and participatory realization of what it meant to be black, not on the soiree scale of the Harlem Renaissance, but on a mass scale. It's a dig at the Harlem Renaissance, which wasn't always on a soiree scale. So, other things about this period that contribute to the conditions that will, give rise to these women. One, the war, of course, right? Because the war does a number of things. It helps to create more opportunities for women because men are away, right? But it also does something to African American consciousness, African American political consciousness. The membership of the NAACP shoots through the roof, largely because of what happens to black soldiers, right? Black soldiers dressed in their uniforms, come and get lynched in the United States, or the treatment of black soldiers in base camps in the South, right? But the membership of the NAACP shoots through the roof. The war also provides better economic opportunity, provides jobs, and we also see these women beginning to join unions, right? Not women, not the artists I'm talking about, but kind of the migrant women who are able to move out of domestic service and into very kind of low-skilled war industry jobs. So the war is also very significant. I mentioned the WWV campaign. The other thing that's significant is the Popular Front. Okay, so the Popular Front was nurtured by a number of organizations that would nurture the talents of these women. The Popular Front is most often associated with the 1940s, but historians of black American literature and culture and social history say that the Popular Front actually extended in black life longer than it did in general on the general left. As early as February 1936, we get a coalition of black groups meeting in Chicago as the National Negro Congress to vow, quote, support for black culture and cultural workers, particularly in the fight against demeaning stereotypical images in the public arts, right? So that's the Popular Front. All of these women are involved in some Popular Front organization, People's Voice, Cafe Society, New Dance Group. They're all engaged, and so those organizations are actually helping to educate them politically, providing nurturance for their art and patronage for their art form, right? Helping them find and identify audiences, and also educating them and giving them a sense of themselves as something, as being very much identified with the black struggle, very much identified with Harlem, but also of that simply being part of a larger, not just nationwide movement of progressive people, but worldwide movement of progressive people, of which Harlem is going to be central. So those are the things that are most significant. Let me rush through this because I don't want to take up too much time. About them. I want to focus on, just briefly, on one of the women, because I thought maybe that might be interesting to know about her. And because she also gives us a, her experiences give us a real sense of the time. So Mary Lou Williams, as I said, Mary Lou Williams was a child prodigy, started playing the piano by ear when she's about 3 years old, never was formally trained, was from Pittsburgh, went on the road for a long time as the main arranger for the Andy Kirk Orchestra. She also, you never hear this, she also arranged for Duke Ellington. Duke Ellington only had two really important arrangers, Billy Strayhorn and Mary Lou Williams. Saying all this, I don't use the word often because I think it's thrown around too much, but I think it's okay to say that she was a genius. It's okay to say that. She is on the road throughout most of her career, but in '43 she comes to Harlem. She settles in Hamilton Terrace. Right? Have any of you been to St. Nick's Pub or any of those places? It's right near there. That's where she settles. She gets an apartment there, and she has this gig down at Cafe Society. Her apartment will become the sort of home space to Minton's club as a kind of public space. So Minton's, of course, is legendary for being the home where Bud Powell and Thelonious Monk and Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker would invent bebop, a new vocabulary for jazz. What isn't as legendary is that Mary Lou's apartment, they were there too. Right? She had a piano, she left the door open, she gave them keys, they worked out a lot of stuff there and recognized her as a kind of godmother to that music. Thelonious Monk would come and wake her up and say, listen to this. And so she's also a kind of tutor there. So she's engaged in the most important kind of cultural movement happening in Harlem at the time. She's playing at Cafe Society. You know, she has like a 9 o'clock show, an 11, no, I think it's like a 7 o'clock show, 9 o'clock show, midnight show. As soon as she's done, she's in a taxi, she hurries up to Harlem, she goes to Minton's, or she goes to 52nd Street. She's there, and then she's at home, right, where her door is always open for these musicians. So that's basically her life. In terms of her political engagement, it largely comes through Cafe Society, because Barney Josephson is the owner of Cafe Society. He encourages his artists to be politically involved. That's why Billie Holiday will sing Strange Fruit, because of Barney Josephson. So he'll send them up to a rally, or send them to a meeting, or say that they're available for any number of things. She's slowly becoming aware about Harlem during this period because of that. Now, after the war is over, music begins to change. Bebop is moved from Harlem to 52nd Street, and Harlem begins to change. She takes some time off from work to really get to know her neighborhood, and she watches as everybody and their mother leaves Harlem, all the middle class, to go to, where do they go? Any idea where they move to, most of them? Queens. They all move to Queens, right? They go to Corona. Billie Holiday moves to Queens. Dizzy Gillespie moves to Queens. Louis Armstrong moves to Queens. I think Dinah Washington moves to Queens. They all move, right? The war opens up certain housing opportunities. The war doesn't just do it. Struggle does it, right? But housing opportunity, things work up. So the black middle class is starting to desert Harlem, right? We get the passage of the Urban Renewal Act, where we get clubs that have been central and mainstays of black community life closing down. And we get the rise for the first time of a discourse about delinquents, juvenile delinquents, gangs, gang war, all the things you would expect when resources and communities, resources move out and communities break up. And she becomes involved in trying to acknowledge and work with young people. It will become central to her for the rest of her life. And her decision to stay in Harlem and to continue to write her music there, even as she leaves, she goes to Paris, she goes to Europe, she keeps that apartment. It's a very conscious political decision that she believes that to transform a community, to change a community, you have to live in that community. You have to be there, right? And so that's what she decides to do. I'll stop there. You have a sense of what this project is all about. If you take nothing else away, take away the project's desire to break down very strict boundaries between what constitutes the political, the social, and the artistic, right? And or to act as if there are activists and there are artists, right? That this kind of collapses some boundaries there. So I'll stop and open it up for questions or comments or anything else that you might have. Yeah. Did I do it in time?
Yes,
yeah. Okay. Yeah. So any questions? Anything? I did give the right talk though. No? Nothing?
It can't be nothing.
Yes.
Well, in last week's class we were talking about art as propaganda and debate about art for the sake of art versus is all art propaganda. So, from what you're saying, I would gather that at least during this time you believe that all art had an embedded political message.
I think it did. Even the art that wasn't explicitly political did. You know, the art that claimed to be art for art's sake had an embedded political message. I think for the artists that I'm talking about, without question it did. Like the least politicized of them was Mary Lou Williams. And one of the reasons why I chose her was that I find it very interesting that she's the one who doesn't have the framework, the analysis, right? She just has like a genuine commitment to her community, right? And that's what makes her become actively engaged. But for all of these artists at this time, they actually, this is interesting, they don't see a distinction between being able to produce high quality art and art that is also politically engaged. Right? For them, there isn't a distinction. So they're not out there producing flat-footed art, right? They're producing complex artworks. Bebop, you know, there's nothing more complex than bebop at this moment, right? I mean, it's engaging all kinds of harmonic structures. But though all of those bebop artists were self-consciously saw their art as being political, even as it was abstract. So yeah. Yes.
I was really interested when you said about that Harlem has always been a contested space. Meaning's always been contested. Because I think a lot about this in relation to gentrification. I was wondering, like, what kind of lessons or like history do you think are really instructive to look at as far as like how debates go on today around
right.
That.
Right. I think the reason why this period is so interesting is that, you know, Harlem is Harlem, the Harlem that the world knows because black people were there, right? Now, they weren't always there. You've learned that, I'm sure, right? They weren't always there. They came, and ever since they came, there's been a slow process of changing that community. The 40s is so interesting, I think, because in that period, you can see that change begin to happen. I mean, it gives us a long view of history. So what you can begin to see, what I mean is, the groundwork that's kind of put down, especially after the war, especially with the passage of the Urban Renewal Act, is groundwork that will allow for the Harlem that we know as a kind of wasteland, as represented as a kind of wasteland and abandoned houses and a drug scourge. That happens in the 40s. What happens in the late 40s allows that to happen. And when that happens, it creates the perfect conditions for people to come in and develop it, right? To say that they're developing it, right? So that's one thing I'd say, is just this kind of long view of history, that gentrification doesn't just start happening when the brownstones start selling for millions and millions of dollars. And some of these women, particularly Petrie, can kind of see it already early on when she sees what's beginning to happen, right? That's one thing. The other thing I think is, I'm getting old, my thought just went out of my head, lessons to be learned. Long view of history, it'll come back to me. But so I think that is probably what we learned from this period most, is that we see Harlem as this vibrant, vibrant place, still kind of having a sense of itself as a cultural capital from the Harlem Renaissance, still coming out of the 30s where it has become a radicalized community, right, through the Depression, right, so radicalized that it will easily elect a communist to city council, right, this real heightened sense of hope and possibility, and hope that's generated by social movement. Right? It's generated by people, by social movement. And yet at the same time, sort of the forces that come in to begin to transform that, some of those forces seeming like opportunities, right? Opportunities so that the middle class can flee, right? And go pursue the dream of great integration. I think the other thing about the lessons that I think we can learn is that the notion that social movements don't just pop out of nowhere like Topsy. You know, if you've read Uncle Tom's Cabin, you know, she's like, I ain't had no mother, I don't have no father, I just is, right? Because everything that we see that will emerge later on in the 1960s are strategies that we see starting in the 1940s. It's important to remember Ella Baker is living in Harlem at this time. Pauli Murray is living in Harlem at this time, too. Oh, the other thing I was going to say is that the other lesson to learn is that people are always engaged in struggle about their communities, always, and maybe not where you expect to see it the most. I think that's another reason why Petrie is interesting, because we know what Adam Clayton Powell is doing, right? But we don't know what kind of the average, everyday, working class woman is doing. What is she doing to try to address the concerns of her community? So that, you know, there's always, it's like Gramsci says, right? There's a kind of a dominant move, but there's always something underneath of it that's still going on. So I think those are the two lessons learned. Yes?
I have another question. To the last point, you stated in order to transform a community, you have to live in that community.
I think that that's what Mary Lou Williams believed.
Yeah. So my question about that is, what are the limitations of the parameters of engagement? Right? So how do you disseminate information if you're not physically there?
Right.
Not necessarily 24/7, but you kind of show this kind of relationship between her residing in Paris and kind of keeping a physical space
Right.
in mind, which I think is something that is prevalent even today, where people own things in the
Right.
but they don't really understand
Right.
the structure. And
Right. Williams, I think, I mean, I was talking about specific moments in her history. One, when she chooses to stay. She doesn't own that apartment. She's paying rent the whole time, right? When she chooses to stay after everyone else leaves, she thinks initially that she's going to Europe for 2 weeks, and unscrupulous producers kind of pull the rug out from under her feet, and then she undergoes a kind of emotional breakdown while she's there. So she ends up staying much longer than she planned. She goes through a religious conversion, which even makes her even more, interestingly, like committed in a way. And when she returns to that apartment in Harlem. Some things she does, you know, you could say are crazy. You know, she tries to run a rehab center in her apartment because so many musicians are on drugs, right? So she brings them to her apartment, feeds them, has them go cold turkey in her apartment. She will open up a thrift store that tries to fund, you know, projects that she's interested in, particularly projects for young people. So I don't think that she is one of those people who moves out but maintains this physical space without being there. When she's there, she's there. She's, you know, she is engaged in that way. Because I think that she would say exactly what you're saying. Like, how do you maintain a sense of engagement if you don't even know? And this is interesting. I didn't say this about her. What really changes her, you know, and makes her begin to believe that, is that she had been living in Harlem for about 3 or 4 years. She was sleeping in Harlem, basically, right? And then or maybe she'd go to the clubs at night, but she was mostly down in the village. She needs a break. She's been performing, she's exhausted, she needs a break. So she takes a break, and instead of going away for her break, she stays in Harlem, and she walks the streets of Harlem, and she realizes, oh my God, I didn't even know this place. I didn't know this community. And she walks it at night versus walking it in the day, because Harlem is a different place at night than it is during the day. And she gets to see it at night, and it's not always pretty. And then one of her neighbors gets killed in a gang war, right? And so I think that notion of you have to be there to be engaged is because it's almost a self-critical notion. I was here all this time, and I didn't even know what was happening in my own community. So I hope that answers your question. Yes?
I have several.
Okay.
I don't know if you want me just to blurt them all out, or?
Blurt two at a time.
Okay.
Yeah.
My first question was, we just read an article for this week about the YWCA
Mm-hmm.
and the role of religion in the family and with Black women.
Mm-hmm.
What was your findings about spirituality with the 4 women that you are based in this project?
Mm-hmm.
And then you also just mentioned that Mary Williams had a religious conversion.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious as to what that was.
Okay. All right. So let me do those two first. Okay, the religion. I would say that my women, are always spiritual people. None of them, at the time that I'm writing about them, are engaged in organized religion. None of them. And I think there's a reason why for each of them. Alice Neale is a Marxist, right? So she's got a critique of organized religion. Pearl Primas, while it's not a kind of self-described Marxist, is a leftist and is discovering, at this point, this is before she goes to Africa. She goes to Africa in 1949, but she's beginning to discover elements of Black spirituality that are not Christian, right? African spirituality, based although she does, interestingly enough, she goes south. And she, in order to learn a kind of vocabulary, a body vocabulary of movement to incorporate in her dance, she lives with sharecroppers and watches their movement in church, especially, kind of the ecstatic movement. But she's not worshiping in those churches. Ann Petrie, if I'm not mistaken, had been a Catholic. Her husband certainly was a Catholic. And before he's deployed overseas, he's in Washington, and he goes into a Catholic church, and the priest says to him, this is a white church, you can't pray here. So he never steps foot in another Catholic church. Mary Lou Williams is, I would say at this point, a seeker. She's a seeker, right? But she's not, interestingly enough, she's not going to church. And I think partly that's because she's a jazz musician. She's in the middle of what many people consider an extremely decadent life, right? Now, the conversion that she undergoes, interestingly enough, is she becomes Catholic. She doesn't become Baptist or Pentecostal. She becomes Catholic. And it's because while she's in Europe and she's undergoing this kind of emotional difficulty, it's priests who reach out to her. So she becomes Catholic, and she comes back and she writes a number of masses around the Black Saint Martin de Porres and things like that. Her religious conviction would definitely inform what she does later on. The other thing I think why Catholicism, I think there are a number of reasons why Catholicism was attractive to her, and we can talk about that later. But interestingly enough, the Black church was not going to accept her music, right, at that time. The Black church, was not going to accept jazz. The Catholic church, well, they weren't really that excited about accepting Black people anyway. They didn't care whether you were singing gospel or jazz, right? So she could write these masses that were really jazz masses in the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church welcomed her in that way. So those are the answers to those two questions. Now, what were the others?
The other two would be, can you talk about why communism was so appealing to artists?
Mm-hmm.
And I see from our syllabus that your background is in English and comparative
Mm-hmm.
literature. And I'm always curious as to what are the novels or the pieces or the articles or the poems that you feel like everybody needs, like maybe the have to read that.
Okay. All right. Okay.
We need to all read.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'll answer that one. I'll answer the first one first. Communism is appealing to Black people during this period, especially during the 30s, because it's the only political party that makes the concerns of African Americans central, right? The only one. And I think that sometimes it's, a full-fledged commitment. Sometimes it's a kind of dance, an interesting dance. What can you do for me? What can I do for you? Right? But I think that's what it is. They are organizing people in Harlem against evictions. The Democrats aren't doing that. The Republicans aren't doing that. So I think that in general you have many black people, even if they don't become communists, open to people who are helping them, right? And also, it's not just in New York. I mean, Robin Kelly's book, Hammer and Hoe, looks at it in Alabama, and how black people aren't pawns of the Communist Party. They actually transform, right? So I think that's one of the reasons. The artists and the intellectual, or the artists in particular, in this group of artists, I would say, it's because, one, they are primarily concerned with issues of poor and working class black people. With the exception of Petrie, they mostly come from the working class. I mean, well, Neale doesn't. Neale comes from the elite class. And they also they have their own kind of cultural heroes who basically model for them how to be an artist. And the two people, for all of them, the black women, who model for them how to be an artist, the two people they adore, Langston Hughes and Paul Robeson. They worship at the feet of Paul Robeson, right? So they have a certain set of models of what it means to be a politically engaged artist. And finally, the Communist Party has, and not necessarily the party itself, but is affiliated with cultural institutions and cultural organs that will support their art, right? Richard Wright, when he wants to become a writer, no one's taking him that seriously, especially about the issues that he's writing about. He is allowed to become a writer. He gets a critical audience. He gets people who will help him read through the John Reed clubs of the Communist Party, right? And so I think all of those are reasons why. Now, my background in English and Comp Lit is so bogus. It's just like, I mean, I love literature. I love the arts. I don't have an English degree anywhere in my background at all. My undergraduate degree is in history and literature. My graduate degree is in American studies. I've always been interdisciplinary to the core. Columbia's English department just happened to say, well, we like the way she does literature, I guess, but mostly they didn't even have anything to do with it. Manning brought me here through African American studies. So, you know, I mean, I happen to be housed in English departments, and, you know, I teach literature, but so I said it. I said it, it's bogus. It is utterly impossible for me to do that task. Like, I did a thing for NPR. Do any of you listen to News and Notes? NPR, Ed Gordon used to have the show. They asked me they had this whole series on reading and writing, and they asked me to do a series where I selected the 6 most influential, or I don't know if they said 6 most influential or important books or writers, that's what they asked me to do. So, I mean, how do I do that, right? 6? I mean, so first I did stuff like, I said, well, I'm only going to have one from before the 20th century. So it's not that the other ones aren't important, but actually that's not true. One for the 18th century, one for the 19th century, and the rest are going to be 20th. I'm only going to have one poet, right? So I had to go through all those artificial things, right? All right, so who did I give them? And I wouldn't give you the same ones to answer your question, but because you wanted 3. Phyllis Wheatley, because she's first, and because I think she deserves reconsideration, because everybody reads that poem that she wrote about, oh, you brought me from pagan Africa, I'm so grateful, you made me a Christian, blah, blah, blah. She was 14 when she wrote that, you know. She has another poem to the Earl of Dartmouth, who's coming over to oversee the colonies, and she talks about, I'm so glad you're coming. She's all caught up in this revolutionary fervor. America awaits you. You know, America wants her freedom, blah, 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 blah. And then, hidden in like the 3rd stanza, she says, you probably wonder how someone like me has so much to say about freedom. And then she goes on to say, you know, I am the epitome of the people who desire freedom, right? You know, so I think she deserves a reconsideration, right? So she was one. The second one I chose was Frederick Douglass, and I still believe whatever list I picked, Frederick Douglass would be it. If you couldn't read anything else, the 1845 narrative, I mean, it transforms American literature. It transforms African American literature, the slave narrative. Slave narrative can never be the same after that, because suddenly it's not just about the escape from slavery to freedom. It's about the kind of psychological interior life of the slave who's brilliant, right? So 1845. And then, what did I select? Now, after this, it gets murky. I'm starting not to remember. I think I selected, that's interesting. Richard Wright. I did Richard Wright because he is the first black writer who can make money as a writer, who can make his living as a writer, because there is no novel before or since that made such a splash as did Native Son. Whatever you think about that novel, it really did create important national dialogue, and also for some of his other writings. But and he also was so influential on the following generation. So Native Son would be one of them. Then I'm trying to think who I picked after that. James Baldwin. And I would say more so than the novels, I would read The Fire Next Time. And then an early essay called Harlem, I think, where he writes about it. He writes about Harlem, what Harlem is like in the 1940s. But he writes about riding through the streets of Harlem on his way to the cemetery of his family to bury his father. But the streets they're riding through, it's the morning after the riots of 1943. Then I picked, how many is that? 4? Oh, wow. So who was number 5? Oh, Zora Neale Hurston. I picked Hurston, not because of her impact during the time when she was published, but because of her impact later on. And because I think Their Eyes Were Watching God is one of the most beautiful novels ever written. And then Morrison. Morrison, yeah, because she occupies a space as a cultural leader, figure, thinker, public intellectual, that I can't think of another black writer who occupied that internationally. So those are my 6. You can pick 3 out of those. Okay. Anything else? Any other questions?
Maybe 2 more questions.
Yeah, there's one back here.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm interested to know how the 4 women you talked about, if they had any interaction with each other. Kind of the second part of the question, you spoke about Alice Neal. If you said she wasn't really accepted because her art wasn't really respected in that time, how art was, but how was she accepted by the community as a white woman?
Good question. 2 of them were friends. Mary Lou Williams and Pearl Primas were good friends because they both worked at Cafe Society. And Pearl Primas would dance to Mary Lou's music all the time, and Mary Lou actually dedicates a song to her. She does a famous Zodiac suite, and she's the first black woman to have her suite played at both Town Hall and Carnegie Hall. And one of these signs, I don't remember which one, maybe it's Libra, is dedicated to Pearl Primas. That's the only personal connection between the 2 of them. Petrie knew of the 3 because she's writing about them. Alice Neal is living in East Harlem, right? And she is, she is a dedicated, devoted artist to her own detriment and the detriment of her children sometimes. But for the most part, she is accepted in that community. I mean, she is an important member of the community. And one of the ways, people talk about her, but one of the ways you can tell also is that people willingly sit for her. She paints, she just paints these incredible portraits. I'll see if I can pass one of them around quickly. They willingly sit for her. She's just kind of this quirky white woman who paints them. And I think that I don't know, I know of very few black neighborhoods that don't have at least one resident who is white. Right? Now, the opposite isn't always true, but Alice Neal would have been that person in Spanish Harlem. So let me see if I can find that. No, I didn't print it out, unfortunately. I'll make sure Professor Marable gets it just so you can see what she does with her community. She documents, this is the way I like to think of her. She documents an emerging community before the social scientists and the media discover it. That's what she does. Yeah. Okay. Yes, Nuri. Hi, Nuri.
I'm fascinated with this migration during this period of time. I want to know, is there presently a black cultural community in Queens? That's my first question. My second question is, protest movement against gentrification. And I know that what's happening in Manhattanville is zoning in more, it is not central Harlem,
Mhm.
secondary displacement.
Mhm.
Politically, socially, do you think there's a silencing?
Of protest against it, or yeah, okay. The first question, Queens. I don't know who lives in. I don't know about a black artistic community in Queens right now. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I just don't know about it. And I should say those people who moved. It's not like the way people move. Like, you know, Aaron Douglas, the painter, used to read Crisis magazine, and he's in Kansas, and he knew that Harlem was where he should be because Langston Hughes was there and Du Bois was there, so he came there. It's not, that movement to Queens in the 40s and 50s is not the same thing. So basically, it's a movement of the black middle class, and these are the musicians who have made it into, you know, they're the elite of that. And so they're moving as a kind of class moves. Now, it's important to Billie Holiday that Armstrong lives around the corner. Yeah, but what I think of it, this is how I think of it. I think of it like there are a lot of black jazz musicians now who live, not just black, but a lot of jazz musicians who live in Montclair, New Jersey. I don't think they went there to start a cultural movement, right? They went there because who can afford to live in New York, because it's the most integrated town, it's a nice town, and it happens to be a hip town because they're there and they play, right? So I think that that's what the Queens move was more like. It wasn't like people moving to follow Spike Lee, like my classmates, you know, in Brooklyn in the 80s or anything. The other question, that's a harder question for me to answer. I mean, I can't answer that as an expert. I think that, is there a silencing? I think that, you know, there's certain things that just don't get coverage, right? I mean, what gets coverage is the new Harlem Renaissance, right? I see a ton of those kinds of articles. The new Harlem Renaissance, there's a Italian bakery just opened, you know. And now we're starting to see things like Copeland's closing, or in the New York Times, or the brother who for years sold the record store, right? That closing, we're starting to see that. But even that isn't done in a very critical way. It's done in a kind of nostalgic way, the passing of the old guard way. When I have gone to anti-gentrification protests, and I haven't gone recently because I've been away, but when I have gone to them, I have seen no evidence of, you know, the mainstream media there at all, really. I mean, I see evidence of, you know, so in that way there might be a silencing. The other thing I think is that this is just a very complicated thing that's happening, you know, because it's not only the new Harlemites are not only defined by their race, right? So it's just a very complicated thing that's happening, so that I don't know that everything is a result of a kind of conscious silencing of protests, although I do believe that exists. And here's another, I just heard recently about a meeting where a lot of people who represented themselves as workers came into a meeting, a kind of not pro-gentrification, but kind of pro-development meeting, but that's not who they were, right? So in that way, it gives the appearance of a kind of balanced view of people on both sides, when in fact, that might not have really been the case. And so that's a different kind of silencing. But, okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.